2016, I adopted Ranger from the local dog pound. His mum had been relinquished, and while she was there, she had 8 puppies. They were crossbreeds, mainly Staffy, German Shepherd. We immediately dove into training, teaching him commands like paw, sit, down, and roll over. We thought we were doing everything right, even reading classic books like Easy Peasy Puppy Squeezy and becoming big fans of Zach George on YouTube, as so many first-time owners do. However, fast forward 6 months and that's when the reactivity kicked in. First it was black dogs, then it was bigger dogs, and then it was male dogs, and eventually all dogs. I followed all the rules. I did my homework, I let him play with other dogs to socialize him, I even used a harness, but still the reactivity persisted. Well, here's the thing, I didn't do anything right at all. I listened to the wrong information, and that's not my fault. It's a common mistake first-time dog owners are still making today. You see, we consume the information we want to hear, not necessarily what we need to hear. We all want things to be easy and fast, so when that information is presented, we consume it eagerly, and it's spread to even more people. And before we know it, we've got a dog reactivity pandemic on our hands. Fast forward to almost 8 years to now, and Ranger is just about the best stooge dog you could ever ask for. And if you ever had the pleasure of visiting our training center, you'd be able to vouch for him. And don't worry, it didn't take us 8 years to get there. He's been a good boy now for the best part of 7 years. But it wasn't always like this. So in today's video, I'm going to talk about all the things that I got wrong and that I see first-time dog owners doing again and again. And more importantly, what I'd do differently if I could hop in a time machine and fix things. Okay, so looking back, there's so much I got wrong with Ranger in the early days. I'm actually amazed that things weren't worse than they were. It's tough to pinpoint exactly which mistakes led to Ranger being so reactive, but let's start with the big one. The socialization process. From 6 to 16 weeks, your dog is in what we call the critical socialization period. This phase, also known as the imprinting period, is where you're supposed to expose your dog to everything you expect them to tolerate as an adult. You know, the whole get them ready for life thing. But this is where it all starts to go pear-shaped. Of course, your vet and every corner of the internet will tell you
you're not allowed to take your puppy anywhere until they've had their second vaccination,
which usually happens at around 12 weeks. Sounds sensible, right? But here's the problem. That leaves you with only 4 weeks of that critical learning period to cram in as much socialization as possible. Now, the challenge here is cramming all of this exposure into a tiny window can actually end up stressing out your dog more than ever. Imagine trying to teach someone everything they need to know in life, but you've only got a month to do it. And it's a bit like trying to cram for an exam the night before, except for the stakes are much higher. The result, you run the risk of overwhelming your pup with too much new information all at once, turning what should be a positive experience into a stressful one. Now, lucky for me, Ranger is a super confident dog, so most things were taken in his stride once we eventually got out there. However, when we did hit 16 weeks, because everything was so new to him, every outing felt like a grand adventure into uncharted territory. Even if he had been somewhere before, it was still all a bit too novel, which made it harder to get his attention or engage with him during walks and training. So what would I do differently if I could rewind the clock? Well, I actually did things very differently with my younger dog, Stark. I took him out before his vaccinations, and let me tell you, it was a completely different ball game with him. Wait until that 12, 13 week mark just doesn't leave a big enough window to get things right. Now, if you're worried about your dog catching something nasty, just carry them around in a blanket. Seriously, although you might look like a bit of a tit, you get the benefits of your pup seeing, hearing, and smelling all these new places, people, and potentially dogs. But that's my next point. So yeah, keep them off the ground, but get them out there. A good rule of thumb I give my clients is to show your puppy somewhere new every other day. The more places they see, the more normal the world becomes. Alright, now that's out of the way, let's talk about the second big boo-boo I made with Ranger. I thought I was doing the right thing, getting him to meet and play with as many dogs as possible. I figured this would make him super comfortable around dogs later on in life. Well, let me tell you, big mistake. Huge. You see, by introducing Ranger to every dog we could find, I inadvertently created this expectation that every time he saw another dog, it was party time. Dogs become an incredible source of excitement and adrenaline for him. So fast forward 6 months, I've got this 25-kilo dog that absolutely loses his mind every time he sees another dog. It's like I'd accidentally turned every dog we passed into his own personal piñata, bursting with fun and excitement. But here's the problem. When every dog is a piñata, how on earth do you get your dog to focus on you? Spoiler alert, you don't. With Ranger's inability to interact with me and his obsession with other dogs, I basically cooked up the perfect recipe for reactivity. All the ingredients were there. A dog who's more interested in four-legged mates than anything else, and a dog that doesn't give two shits about what I'm doing. If you've ever seen Plutchik's Wheel of Emotions, you'll notice that frustration and aggression actually sit right next to each other. That's because for dogs, and us as humans, frustration can easily boil over into aggression. It's like when you're stuck in traffic and someone cuts you off. Before you know it, you're ready to explode. And it's not that different for our dogs. With Ranger, every time he couldn't meet another dog, the frustration just built up. So instead of learning how to stay calm around other dogs, he got more and more amped up. And that's part of the reason we ended up with such a reactive dog. So what would I do differently? Well, I'd still let Ranger meet other dogs. I'm not trying to turn him into a social recluse, but I'd be a lot more selective about it, prioritizing social interactions with older, calmer dogs. The goal would have been to teach him that dogs are just part of the scenery, nothing to get excited or scared about, just background noise. Again, with Stark, my younger dog, I did things differently. Anytime he spotted another dog, I made sure I became the most interesting thing to him in that moment. Seeing another dog meant it was time for me and him to have some fun, not him and the other dog. The result? Stark's probably the most socially stable dog you'll ever meet. Other dogs are just part of the landscape for him, like trees, lampposts, post boxes. You get the idea. So if you're raising a puppy right now, take it from me. Don't turn every dog into a piñata of excitement. Instead, make sure you're the most exciting thing in your dog's world, and trust me, it'll save you a lot of headaches later on down the line. With all that said, I was actually doomed from the start. That's because Ranger would very rarely take treats outside, which made training increasingly difficult. But here's the kicker. This was all down to a mistake that I bet you're probably making too. If you spent 5 minutes on YouTube looking up dog training, you've probably been told to stuff your dog's face with high-value treats just to get them to focus outside. Sounds easy enough, right? Well, if you're like me, you've tried this and it worked. Until it didn't. You probably noticed that after about 3 days, your dog couldn't care less about these so-called high-value treats, and they start turning their nose up at them, and you're left wondering what went wrong. Here's the thing. Those high-value treats aren't high-value at all. They're just temporarily high-value because of the novelty. But as we know, novelty wears off around day 3, and voila, your dog no longer gives two shits about food outside. You're back to square one, and your dog's there living their best life, but completely ignoring you. So how do we use positive reinforcement when our dog is constantly turning their nose up at food? Well, first we need to get our dogs working for minimum wage. And I know it sounds harsh, but think about it. Imagine that spoiled kid that finally gets their first job. They've been handed everything on a silver platter their whole life, and now they have to stack shelves for less than £10 an hour. Well, that's exactly what I did to Ranger. He had a buffet of treats anytime he wanted, and I was essentially paying him a ridiculously high salary for doing the easiest of jobs. No wonder why he's always asking, what else have you got? Eventually, I was spending a small fortune on these gourmet mini burger treat things, and sure, he'd eat them most of the time, some of the time. Rarely. But the moment another dog appeared, those burgers might as well have been stale bread. I was following all the online advice, yet it still wasn't working. It was beyond frustrating. What I wish I had done was put Ranger on a minimum wage from day one. His daily food portion would go straight into a treat pouch, and that's all that would pass his lips. This essentially recalibrates your dog's food motivation, making them more likely to take food outside. And guess what? That's exactly what I did with Stark. Now, that's a dog that'll practically take your fingers off half a piece of kibble, making him an incredibly easy dog to train. This is the importance of work ethic. Without it, you'll have to motivate your dog in other ways, which isn't ideal, especially with puppies. Think of it this way. Chocolate cake isn't a treat if your diet consists of nothing but chocolate cake. You're not going to rush home to eat a chicken breast salad if you're stuffed with cake. And let's be honest, can you imagine how unhealthy it would be to only eat chocolate cake? So if you're struggling to get your dog's focus outside, take a step back and reassess how you're using treats. Put your dog on minimum wage and you might just find that suddenly even the simplest of rewards become worth working for. All right, let's dive into the fourth and maybe most important mistake I made with Ranger. This one is so underrated, it is insane, and following the next piece of advice could save you from literally being bit in the arse later on down the line. It might sound trivial, but if I could go back and change one thing, it'd be this. Using a house line. Now, if you've never heard of a house line, it's basically a leash that you use inside the house with your dog. And trust me, this is by far the simplest, most effective way to interrupt bad behavior and guide your dog towards the good behavior. If you're not already using one, you should be. See, as your puppy is figuring out human life, they're bound to get a few things wrong. Maybe it's chewing on the skirting boards, having a little nibble on your fingers, or even the odd accident in the house. And that's all totally normal. But here's what we know. Any behavior that goes ignored is likely to get worse. And you don't want it to get worse, trust me. Ranger was no different. He tore up carpets, skirting boards, rugs, kitchen furniture. If it could be destroyed, Ranger was on it. No matter how much I tried to distract him, he was more interested in redecorating the house than anything I had to offer. And not only was this incredibly annoying, but what I realize now is that every time he ignored my pleas to stop, he was essentially learning how to ignore me everywhere, including outside. With a house line, your options are pretty limited. You can bribe your dog away from the naughty behavior, which actually just reinforces it. Or you could use harsh punishment to deter it, but that's not nice and it risks damaging your relationship with your puppy. Or you can grab them by the collar, drag them away from it, which is super intrusive and ultimately creates a lot of conflict every time you try and touch them. It's probably the #1 reason I see people get bit later on down the line. So here's maybe the simplest but most effective piece of dog training advice you'll ever receive. If your puppy gets up to no good, use the house line to interrupt this behavior, count to 4, and guide them towards something positive to do instead. For example, if they're chewing on the rug, gently move them away from it with a house line, count to 4, place them on their bed with a chew toy instead. If they're going at your hands like a little piranha, stop them with the house line, count to 4, then give them a Kong to gnaw on. This super simple method can save you so much grief later on down the line. It's like setting a foundation for a house. You get it right early on and everything falls into place. But ignore it and you'll be patching up cracks for years to come. Ranger taught me that the hard way. So if your puppy is causing chaos in the house, grab a house line, give it a go, and thank me later. If you found this video helpful, make sure you like, subscribe, and hit that bell icon for more tips. And as always, let me know in the comments what kind of mischief your puppy's up to. I'd love to hear it.